The Tim Heale Podcasts. Ordinary people's extraordinary stories.
Welcome to the Tim Heale Podcasts. In this episode, I'm going to have a chat with Joe. Joe's going to tell us all about his life. So, Joe, if you can tell me when and where you were born, and if you can describe what it was like where you grew up, the schools you went to, and the education that you received. So, welcome, Joe.
Tim, thanks for having me. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Not too bad at all. So I'm in the U.S. I'm currently about 45 minutes from where I was born and grew up, which was in a small town that was a suburb of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The town's called Lansdale. I was a 1960s baby. Gosh, my childhood and what was it like? It was kind of very typical 1960s suburban America. My father worked in a factory. My mother was a secretary. I was able to walk to school until I made it to high school, and then, took a bus. So, it was really kind of an unremarkable childhood, I guess, in that sense. Ultimately, I guess was rather privileged, had things pretty easy.
So what was the neighborhood like?
Oh, it was kind of very, very typical of that time period for suburban America. It was, I would say, middle class, white American, very little diversity. I'm actually very proud of the neighborhood now. I don't get back that often, but when I do, it's an extremely diverse neighborhood. Definitely much more interesting in that regard. But it was quiet. We were able to, play in the street. So we played baseball and football and all that kind of stuff in the street. Didn't really have to worry about traffic.
So when a car did come along, you say, "Car."
That's
so
it. Exactly.
So
yep.
we went off to the side and then he said,
Yep.
"Game on."
Yep. And everybody knew each other. All the parents knew all the kids. So, we get up in the morning, eat breakfast, leave the house, and be back in time for lunch or dinner. And a lot of times we'd wind up, eating lunch at a friend's house. But, the deal was we had to be back for dinner. And my parents had a simple rule. It's like, just tell us where you're going to be. And if we go to look for you there, you better be there. Because obviously this is, pre-smartphones and pagers and everything else. So, we pretty much had the days to ourselves and we did our own thing.
Yeah. So you riding bikes around in that area?
Oh yeah. Yep. Riding bikes, playing all kind of games.
Yeah. I kind of picture the sort of street that you live on is one of these big wide open streets with sort of detached houses all the way down with the big long drives and to earn a few bob.
We were a little more middle class. We were duplexes, so small driveways, and connected houses in pairs. So you were fairly close to your neighbors. Wasn't like a row home, but they were fairly close at the time. These types of houses in the late 50s, early 60s, when these houses were built, they were very popular on the East Coast, very popular kind of suburban homes. It wasn't really, at least here in the US, it wasn't really until kind of middle 70s that people decided they were kind of tired of living on top of each other. And that's when everybody had to have kind of the really big homes with 4 and 5 bedrooms. And then property values went up, and then everybody still wanted big homes with 4 and 5 bedrooms, but they built them on little tiny 1-acre lots. So you had huge homes that you could essentially spit and hit the house next to you, even though you're in what looks like it should be a house on 3 or 4 acres of property. It's not. It's So yeah, for me, I enjoyed being close to the neighbors. I enjoyed having people around. My friends were around. So it never fazed me.
So what was the walk to school like then? How far was that?
Grade school. So kindergarten through 6th, it's very short. It was like a 10-minute walk. So it was real simple. The junior high school that I went to, so that was 7, 8, 9. That was literally only about a quarter of a mile further from my grade school. So very easy, very simple. Generally when you're walking to and from school, there's loads of other kids walking. So nothing particularly adventurous about it. It really was, pretty simple.
So this is the pre-driving everywhere era then.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think when I started grade school, I'm pretty sure my family didn't own a car. So it wasn't until I was further into grade school that my father got a car.
So what was the sort of the curriculum like that you were doing? Was it like the state school?
Yeah, I mean, these were public schools. So, it's really very generic. There were, sadly, I'm old enough, before they did kind of like the advanced classes and all that kind of stuff where, kids would test. And if they were really smart, they would take like an advanced class. That kind of stuff didn't come into play until I was in middle school. It was the first time that there were any like advanced classes that kids could test into. So the curriculum itself was, very basic, very generic. You did your reading, your writing, your arithmetic. You had recess every day. You had gym class and art class, once or twice a week.
So what was your gym like? Did you play a lot?
It's usually like playground games. We had a small gym in our grade school, but that also doubled as the cafeteria. So depending on, what period you had gym, you may not be able, your class may not be able to use the cafeteria. So usually gym took place outside on the playground. It could be anything from dodgeball to just, doing crazy little fitness challenges and things like that. Nothing particularly fancy.
Yeah. So what was your favorite subject?
When I think most of the time my favorite subject was history. Definitely by the time I got to middle school, history was my favorite subject. I remember 7th grade, I had a teacher that I was afraid of. Everybody was afraid of this guy. He was tough. That was like his MO. He was a tough guy. And this was in a time period where corporal punishment was still a thing. So, you could get smacked, you could get hit with a paddle, that kind of stuff. So he kept a paddle by his desk. Guys that would act up in class would have to do push-ups next to his desk. He told us on the first day of school, you will have homework every single day. And he kept his promise. But what was great about the guy is he was passionate about what he taught, and he taught the American Revolution. So he did an incredible job of really kind of bringing it to life for us. And I have the good fortune of being in a suburb of Philadelphia. We're close to a lot of the key locations where things happened during the American Revolution. So we were able to do field trips and go and see a lot of these places at the time. So that kind of also became kind of my favorite time in history in terms of what I studied. And I think it's the one that I've retained the most information about, because he didn't teach it by just having its, memorized dates and all that kind of stuff. He really taught it so that we could understand it and understand what it was like. So I think for that reason, history has always kind of had a special place for me, because if you can really kind of connect the dots to your experience, to what the experience must have been like, it's hard for it not to be fascinating.
Yeah. So did you see some of the reenactment groups and stuff? Like, was that popular at the time?
And I mean, that was a big thing, because I was 16 years old in 1976, which was our bicentennial. So the reenactments were huge at that point in time, and they were happening everywhere. I lived only 30 minutes from Valley Forge, So, I was very close to all of these spots where, you read about it in the history books and you learn about it in the history books. So,
so history is a bit of a passion of mine as well.
mhm.
In fact, this summer, the wife and I are going off to France, Spain, and we're going to visit some of the Peninsular War
Very
battlefield
cool.
sites of Salamanca, Talavera, Badajoz,
Mhm.
Vitoria.
Very cool.
And then we're going to pop down to Gibraltar and then nip across to Tangier for the day, and then work our way back up through Porto and back across. So, yeah, we're looking
Awesome.
forward to that.
Awesome.
Yeah. Right then. So, going into high school,
Mhm.
how was your high school? You said you had to jump on a bus? Is that like one of these big yellow buses, school
Yeah,
bus?
it was a yellow American school bus. High school was great for me, but I had a very non-typical high school experience. I got into photography very young. I got my first camera when I was 11 in 7th grade. Ninth grade, actually. Sorry, ninth grade is when I had my first picture published. And so by the time I got to high school, I was already doing freelance work for the local newspaper. I was doing all of the public relations photography for my school district. So I had a kind of a really good scenario. I would frequently get a phone call in the morning from the school district's PR guy. And, basically he would say, "Hey, listen, do you have a test first period?" And my answer was no. He's like, "Great. Don't go to the high school. I want you to go to this elementary school and you're going to take a picture at 8 o'clock in the morning and then we'll drive you over there." So, they had kind of worked it out with my teachers and my principals. I had good grades. And so the deal was, as long as I could maintain my grades, if I had an opportunity to go do a photography assignment, even for the local newspaper, that was the only excuse I needed to miss class and I could go do the assignment. So I was really, really lucky that the school kind of supported this passion that I had and supported the opportunities that I had created. And I kept my grades up. Nobody ever complained, and I went and did what I did. So that really was kind of the launching point for my career, because I was working already at that point.
Yeah.
And, you know,
So from the point of taking the pictures, I mean, that's
Mhm.
one thing.
Right.
How do you go about the developing? Did you have to take it to the local chemist to get done, or did you
Oh,
have
no,
your
no, no,
own
no. I did
at
all
your
my
home?
own. I started doing my own processing pretty early in the learning curve. I got my first camera when I was 11. Probably by the time I turned 12, my dad had helped me build a darkroom in our basement. So I had a darkroom. I did all my own developing. The only stuff that you would send away would be color film and color slides. We always joke that that's basically when you would take pictures and then you would wait 7 days to find out how bad you suck. Because you had to wait for him to come back to say, man, that was not a good day.
Yeah.
But yeah, I started with the darkroom work really very early on, and I really enjoyed it. It's funny because I will sit here and I will tell you how much I enjoyed it. I'm so glad I did it. And then people will say, well, if you had the chance to go work in the darkroom now, would you? And my answer is hell no. No way. It's like, I'm really glad that I did. Like, it was just awesome. But I ultimately don't have the patience. So digital photography is perfect for me, because, I can shoot, I can sit down in front of my computer and in moments, it's done without the hassle of having to maintain chemicals and everything else. So, and, don't even necessarily need a dedicated space. I can take my computer with me anywhere and I can work on my pictures. So I very much like the advancements that we have. But I'm glad, because what it did do is it helped me learn a discipline in photography. It helped me learn to pay attention to details, which is extremely important for consistent and good photography. And those are things that photographers very much struggle with today, because there isn't a part of the process that forces that learning curve. So I was very lucky to, learn that way, because I think it definitely made a difference, at least for me, made a big difference.
So while you were doing all this, going through school, you're getting the little assignments from the local rag.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have actually a class? How did you learn the skills? Did you learn it from books, or did you have a class in it?
So I didn't learn it. I didn't learn it from books. We'll start there. All the books, this would have been like 1971 through 1978 when I graduated high school. And pretty much all the photography books at that time were black and white, written and published in the 1950s and 60s. They were huge and dry and boring and all about rules and more about photo history than technique. There was nothing creative about them. There was nothing that was new and different. And so I had no patience for the books. I did not take any classes. Well, I took one photography class in high school. It's kind of a very long story. So the short version is I took the class. I failed the class out of stubbornness with the teacher, but on my final report card, I got an A on the class because the principal of the school reversed the grade. And so it was, just kind of a butting of heads with the teacher at the end of the school year. And I refused to do an assignment the way she wanted it done. And what it was is she wanted me to work in the darkroom at school, because she had never seen me work in the darkroom. She said, for all I know, your dad does your developing for you. And I said, look, I do all the work for the school district. I'm working for a school newspaper. My father is not developing my film. And the reason I wouldn't work in the darkroom at school was because, unfortunately, she did not manage it very well. So kids always screwed around in there. Kids would come in, flip the lights on, that kind of stuff. And I wasn't going to risk having my work ruined. So I refused to do it. I turned the assignment in, did the assignment. But so anyway, so I only ever took one photography class. So for me, it was a combination of screwing a lot of stuff up and looking at it and trying to figure out how to fix it. And I was incredibly lucky to find what I've learned after the fact were some incredible mentors. These were working photographers at the time that I wouldn't even say took me under their wing, but they gave me the time of day. If I had a question, if I had a question, they would listen to the question. And for a long time, I used to think they just enjoyed torturing me because I didn't realize really what they were doing. But after they listened to my question, they'd ask me 10 more questions. And by the time they got done asking me questions, I had figured out the answer to my own question. I found that annoying because I just wanted the answer. But what they were doing was two things. One, they were teaching me the critical thinking that was necessary. And two, they were teaching me that I was actually capable of answering it myself, that I didn't need to ask them. And if I reached the point as they're asking me questions where they realized I did not have the knowledge base to answer that question, then it would be a brief moment of, come here, let me show you something. And they'd go and they'd demonstrate something or show me how something worked. And then it was right back to the questions. It was never, here's your answer, right? But it was great learning experience. As frustrating as it was at the time, and I just thought, honestly, at first, I thought it was kind of a photographer thing because there were 3 or 4 photographers that I would run into routinely and talk to, and they all kind of did the same thing. And we've lost a lot of that learning ability today. And I'm all about technology. I'm all about the internet. I'm sitting here in front of 3 big computer screens and a huge computer. Everything that we have with this technology is incredible. But part of what it's also done is it's given us so many incredible resources that we get lazy in terms of problem solving and in terms of actually learning, because I can just go watch a video, or, there's bound to be something in Google. And there's a few disconnects. Number one, because there's so many resources, we are pretty confident we can just find the answer. We're not going to have to think about it. We're not going to have to consider it. We're just going to find the answer. And then what we have is an answer without actual learning or context, because adults, humans, we learn better from doing than we do from reading and memorizing. Those are two completely separate parts of the brain.
Yeah.
So, again, it's a little bit of, kind of being lucky about the timing and then meeting some right people. But my photography education has just been really kind of self-driven. And still to this day it is. I'm a firm believer. The day that I stop learning, I'm done. Just put the cameras away, move on to something else. That's
Every
for
day's a
me
school day.
part of what makes it exciting.
Yeah. So every day's a school day.
Yep.
And I'm still learning my craft. So I'm loving doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So what happened when you graduated high school?
So when I finished high school, I was incredibly lucky, and I landed a job as a chief photographer of a small town newspaper. Was about 40 minutes from where I grew up, and I was responsible for a staff of 5 photographers as an 18-year-old kid who had no clue about managing people. But fortunately, these guys tolerated me, and it was a great learning experience. It was late 70s. Photojournalism was in its heyday. Newspapers were using pictures big and using lots of pictures. So photography was very much a priority in the news gathering business. And we covered everything. I mean, we chased car accidents, we chased fires, we chased everything. It was all about showing it. And so it was also just, continue to be great learning experience, every single day going out and illustrating news stories. And I've always kind of connected with photographing people. My logo and my tagline is "I shoot people." So what the newspaper business really taught me was about people in general, because as a newspaper photographer, you were walking into other people's lives for, shall we say, 10 minutes at a time. But you, most of the time, were walking into other people's lives at the highest of highs, if you were lucky, more often than not, the lowest of lows, where they don't really want you there in the first place.
Yeah.
So
I guess newspapers, it's bad news sells and good news is,
unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah.
The good news stuff was usually feature stories, which were fun because you get to spend more time with the subject. You can be more creative. You can do a little bit more planning. So you got a little bit more opportunity to kind of to be creative, to put a little bit of yourself into the story. With the news stuff, the stuff that's, kind of happening and has that immediacy to it. Yeah, at that point, it's kind of like, getting onto a roller coaster without a seatbelt or a lap bar, and you hang on for dear life. And your job is find that moment that tells the story. And you try to be creative in terms of finding really good lighting or finding a really interesting camera angle. But in those kind of situations, that's not always possible. So the moment trumps everything. It's, find that moment that really illustrates, what's happening.
So I guess you have to have a really, really good eye to start with, to look
You
at
do, and you develop
know
it.
how to take the shot.
Yeah, you develop that technique and that skill. I think that for me as a photographer, that concept of a good eye, I think it's a never-ending process, because part of the challenge is, I find today, like I'm known ironically for really creative photography, and I don't consider myself to be super creative. I could name 100 photographers that I admire and even hate a little bit because they're so talented. I can't see the world the way they see it. But one of the challenges that I find at my age, and I think the way that I approach it is what helps me so much. Every time I pick up a camera, there's automatically a little bit of kind of been there, done that, because I've been shooting for so long and I photographed so many different things. it would be really easy to just kind of draw on a prior experience with that subject matter and think, oh, okay, well, I know I can do this or I can do that. But that also would make my images very predictable. And that for me is boring. So it's kind of a nonstop challenge. I'll listen to the been there, done that in my head. And that's exactly what I won't do. So, then my challenge is, okay, so how can I approach this subject matter, but I can't do what I did before? This is how I've handled it in the past. I've got to find a completely different way to do it. And that kind of helps keep me fresh. It helps keep me looking at new ideas. And just like having a good eye, that's a skill set that's something you practice. It's like a muscle. You have to keep working on it.
Yeah.
And it's that idea of just almost intuitively looking for different ways to connect the dots. And that helps make your pictures stand out because they're not what people are expecting to see.
Yeah. So let's just take you back just a little bit. So you've got a job on this little provincial newspaper. You've got 5 photographers working for you.
Yep.
Back in that day, it's all wet film, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So did you have somebody dedicated to the darkroom work?
No, we all did our own.
We
all did our own. We were a small paper, and we all did our own. 2 of the photographers were part-time photographers. 3 of us were full-time. But we all did all of our own darkroom work.
So take us through a sort of a typical day at that time. So you rock up in the morning. I guess you have a meeting in the morning, and then I guess the editors will give you what they want for that day's shoot or
close.
Views.
Yeah. We didn't necessarily have meetings in the morning, but as a photographer, if you were working a day shift, you would come in the morning and there was a spot in the newsroom that you would go to find out what assignments were in for the day. And it literally was just a little rack. There was 7 rows, 1 for each day of the week. And the various editors who were tasked with generating assignments, it might be the sports editor, might be a features editor, news editor, or whatever. They would simply fill the assignments out on little printed 3x5 cards, note cards, and they drop them in the bin. So you come in the morning and you pull everything out of the bin, see what you had for the day. That would kind of give you a sense of, okay, this is what this day is going to involve. Given that, we didn't have computers and internet and things like that. Once you knew what your assignments were, you may be going and checking maps to figure out how long is it going to take me to drive someplace and, what's the route to get there. You may, if it's a feature story, be going and talking to the writer who's writing that story to get a sense of kind of what their angle is, what they're trying to show, even to learn more about the subject if they've already, because frequently the story would already actually be written or the interview would be done and the writer would be working on the story when they assign you to go out. You wouldn't necessarily go out with the writer. So at that point, it's a matter of talking to the writer, getting a sense of, okay, what can I expect when I go here? What's this person like? So it's, a little bit of kind of research on the assignments, kind of just getting your head wrapped around this is what's involved. If you're going to be in the road most of the day, like if the assignments are close enough together that you're going to leave the building and then probably not come back till the end of your shift, you want to make sure you've got enough film with you, that you have got all the right gear. So it was kind of, planning time. And then if you actually had downtime, you would go and hang out in the dark room. We had a small office outside the dark room. You go hang out down there just to stay out of the fray upstairs. That time might be for filing. It might be for, putting stuff away, all that kind of stuff. Busy work.
Yeah. So the newspaper itself then, was that a daily newspaper or did it go out once a week?
Yeah, it was a daily
newspaper. So you're also then, I guess, having to work to timelines.
Oh yeah. I mean, you have deadlines in that sense. So we were a Monday through Friday daily. We didn't publish on the weekends. When I first started with them, it was afternoon publication. So the paper hit the streets usually like between, I think, 2 and 4 in the afternoon. So our deadline was like late morning. For about a year, they switched over to an AM publication, which was just brutal. So that meant the paper hit the street at like 6 a.m. in the morning. So our press deadline, or excuse me, our content deadline was like 2 a.m. in the morning. That's when like everything had to be upstairs on the boards. And yeah, that was the worst. I mean, it would never fail. There would be like a car accident or a fire at 1 a.m. in the morning. And so you would get sent out, photograph this, and you get back and you've got, 15 minutes until deadline. So that's what we used to call that printing wet. And so we would develop the film. We wouldn't dry it properly. We would basically put it under a sink on a piece of glass and run water and then slide the film onto the glass. The water would create a seal. And then we take that and we put that in the enlarger, and you had about 5 minutes to print it before you'd start to see bubbles between the film and the glass. So you print it wet. And then while the print was drying to go upstairs, you'd take the film and the glass, put it back underwater, separate it, and then hang the film up and dry it the way that you normally would have done it, in the first place. But it was all things to kind of cut corners and be able to get a print, because we actually had to physically make prints, which they then put in front of a big process camera to make the page negatives so that they could burn the plates for the printing press.
So you had the print press on site then?
Oh, yeah.
So it's all done in-house.
Yep.
And
I mean, back in the day, if you had a newspaper, you had a printing press. Now, there are massive printing facilities that will print 7, 8, 9, 10 different newspapers, and they truck them to where they're going.
Yeah, so I guess from your point of view, I mean, deadlines are a nightmare.
It's just something you got used to. You know, it's kind of one of the things. It went with the job territory. There were good days and there were bad days, right? But yeah, I mean, it was. I think for me, newspaper photography, where I started, the fun of it was the challenge. I mean, you were trying to take pictures frequently in situations where people didn't want you to take pictures. You were photographing against competition because there were lots of newspapers. So you had competition for big news stories. You were working on deadlines. So every day was kind of a challenge. And that's what I really enjoyed about it. If I went to work and my first assignment of the day was, we used to call them grip and grins, which would be like, somebody presenting a check to an organization, it's like, that's kind of where the groan is like, it's like, there's no challenge in that. They're just kind of boring. It's always going to be the same size in the paper. It's always going to be down towards the bottom of the page. Kind of nobody cares, but it was for the stuff that was challenging. That's what made the job, really exciting.
And I guess you get a byline on every image that you get published.
Yep.
So,
and that's honestly, it's the byline that got me hooked on doing newspaper work. When I was 14 and I had the picture published in the paper, it was the byline, like seeing my name on the front page of the paper, and so the 14-year-old mind, at the masthead on the top of the page, right underneath the name of the paper, it said read by 22,000 people daily. Right.
Yeah.
So the 14-year-old mind sees my name under a picture read by 22,000 daily. It's like, wow, 22,000 people know I took that picture. like they all read the byline, right? But that's, that was the connection. And that was kind of like the drive behind all of it, because it was this kind of feeling of satisfaction. It's like, look, I did that and everybody knows I did that. Which I don't know what that says about me at the time, but at least I'll admit that was the drive. And I think almost any photographer you talk to at any age, especially, at my age or older even, they'll acknowledge that bylines never get old. They just don't. I had a German magazine come out a few days ago with an article that I did, and I got the cover and the whole bit, and it never gets old, right? I don't chase the byline like I used to, because as a newspaper photographer, yes, it was all about get that incredible shot and make sure I had your name on it. I don't live for bylines anymore, but I still get the same rush anytime I have a byline. I mean, it's a sense of satisfaction.
Yeah. So, how long was you at the paper for before you moved on?
I guess I stuck with about 5 years. I got married very young. I was 20 when I got married. Had a son when I was 22, and then started to realize that newspaper work for me, it was a lifestyle. It wasn't a job. It's kind of very much who I was, and it was really not ideal for family and raising a son and everything. So I got this really brilliantly stupid idea that I would start a portrait and wedding business and start doing portraits and weddings. And so that's what I did.
So how did you set up on your own then? Did you get a shop, or
I was fortunate enough to find a spot that I could use as a studio very inexpensively, and took out an ad in the Yellow Pages, which is what photographers did for advertising in the mid 1980s at that point. And pretty much fell flat on my face. I mean, I hustled, I did a lot of networking, but I had really no idea about how to build a business or run a business. And I was, again, very lucky to find a mentor. The mentor happened to be a loan manager at a bank who had given me a loan, and then who was tasked with repossessing the car that was attached to that loan. And he showed me a lot of mercy and a lot of empathy. And he told me that if I showed up at his office the next morning with all of my books, my accounting, and if I agreed to come back once a month and sit down with him until the loan was paid off, he let me keep the car. And he basically taught me how to run a business, saved my hide big time. And I turned it around and had a very successful portrait and wedding studio. But if it had not been for that man's generosity with his time, and this was back at the time where, especially small town banks, the loan officers, if they had to repossess a car or something like that, they actually had to go out with the guy in the tow truck. It's not like now where you have companies that go out and do all this repo stuff. So, they were kind of on the hook for their reputation within the bank if the loan failed. So he saw it as part of his responsibility to help me succeed so the loan didn't fail, which was incredible, and really saved my hide big time.
So how long did you have that business for?
Well, I did studio work, so that business evolved, but I did studio work, gosh, probably well into the mid 90s. I say it evolved. So one of the things that I frequently tell people sincerely is I'm not sure what I'm going to do when I grow up. I really am not. I do know there will be a camera involved. There's always been a camera involved. So the portrait and wedding stuff, I say, was at the core of what I was doing for about 5 years. And I didn't stop doing it. But what I started doing is I just happened to pick up a couple commercial advertising clients and was really kind of enjoying that and getting really excited about that. And then started doing more and more of that and started chasing fewer and fewer portrait and wedding projects. Eventually did stop taking portraits and wedding. Well, not portraits, but stopped taking weddings altogether. But by that time, I was also starting to do some food photography, which was kind of a natural spinoff from the commercial advertising stuff, because I had found a client that was a national chicken processor. And I was doing all of their advertising work. And so it's always kind of been, an evolving thing. So the studio work went well into kind of the mid 90s. And by that time, even it was still studio work, but I was starting to do a lot of fashion photography. I had made some connections and had picked up a couple clients still in the 80s, but that was starting to pan out into other things and other projects. And, by mid 90s, I was doing a lot of fashion. And then by early 2000s, the fashion industry was going through a lot of changes, just like the newspaper industry had gone through a lot of changes. So I started kind of evolving that skill set. And instead of going after publication work, I was doing more work with models and shooting modeling portfolios and helping models develop and get their careers launched. So again, it's always kind of always been an evolution. So the studio stuff, it really started, you know, in the mid 80s, and it's kind of just kept evolving since. And from that time, I've primarily been a studio shooter, primarily.
Yeah. So you got into the big studios with no floor, so everything sort of you're shooting like cars and stuff like that, and you get totally confused in the room where you don't know which way is up.
Yeah, kind of. I've never owned a studio that's big enough to shoot a car, but I have done motorcycles in my studios. So yeah.
So when did you come across to digital?
Pretty early. The year 2000.
What was your first digital camera?
Well, my very first digital camera was actually in the 1990s, probably 1997 or so. And it was not a professional camera, but it was a digital camera. It was a Sony Mavica. It was one of the cameras where you actually put the floppy disk in the camera. One of the little square, 3.5-inch floppy disks that we use for our computers. You actually put that in, and that was the media that the camera recorded to. But my first professional digital camera was the Nikon D1. It's the first pro digital camera that Nikon released, and that was in the year 2000. And I very quickly gave up on film, very quickly. For me, the separation between the two is, obviously I knew film, I loved film, I was confident and comfortable with film. But with film, when you press the button, the picture's essentially done. And if you're shooting black and white, you can manipulate it a little bit in the darkroom. But if you're shooting color transparency, slides, that's done. That's the picture. Digital from the very beginning opened up all of these possibilities. And, a lot of the work that you see on my website is work that when I pressed the button, I was maybe 50% of the way to completion of the shot. The remaining work was being done in post-production in Photoshop by adding backgrounds, manipulating things, changing things. Now, to be clear, for photographers that hear that may be kind of new to the process, that doesn't mean you just kind of shoot whatever and you figure it out later. That's not the way you get good pictures. So on those times where I'm pressing the button and I'm only 50% of the way to the end, I know where that 50% is coming from when I press the button. If I'm going to change the background, as an example, I've got the new background sitting on a computer in the studio so that I can look at the images and make sure that the lighting blends together properly and, everything's going to fit right, that type of stuff. So it's not just kind of by chance, it's a planned thing, but it allows me to really expand the toolkit of what I can do creatively with an image. Now, certainly if I was shooting news, I can't do that, right? But since I'm doing this creative work at this point, and most of my work now is geared towards being able to teach, which is why I do the creative stuff to really get attention. I can go in any direction that I want with the images.
So Adobe Photoshop. I guess that came along around about the same sort of time as the digital cameras.
Yeah, actually a little bit before, believe it or not. I think Photoshop first came out in the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, I started using Photoshop right about the time I got the Nikon D1. So it was right around 2000.
Yeah. So did you go on a course for it? Or did you just try and pick it up as you went along and try and
just
figure
picked it up as I
out?
went along? Photoshop is, I have bought a couple books early on. I bought a couple books. And then quickly realized that was a big waste of money because while the books were very good, Photoshop is an incredibly advanced piece of software. And I don't say it to scare people away, but that's what makes it cool.
Yeah.
You could take any technique, and you could go to a bookstore and pull 4 books off the shelf and you'll find at least 3 different ways to accomplish the same thing. Or you could take any technique and you go to YouTube and probably find 100 videos on that technique. And out of that 100 videos, you'll probably be able to find 6, 7, or 8 different techniques that all do the same thing. So the real key to learning Photoshop, and again, people tend to be lazy, so they look for shortcuts, and that's why they really keep struggling. They want to find a video that says, yes, the best way to do it is this way, just do that. And the problem of it is that only helps you with that particular picture that has that particular look, etc. The key to learning Photoshop is really just taking the time to really understand what every little slider or control actually does to your image. Because unfortunately, a lot of them aren't obvious. People think they're obvious. Like there's a slider called contrast. Well, okay, you would expect that plus means more contrast, minus means less contrast. Well, that is exactly what it does. But what that doesn't tell you is that when you use the contrast slider, it's impacting every tone and every color in your image by the same amount, which means 99.9% of the time, it never looks good. But right underneath the contrast slider are 2 sliders called highlights and shadows, which is basically what makes up contrast. So the smart way to really mess or alter the contrast in your image is not with a contrast slider, but with the highlights and shadows, because you have more control over it. So once you understand what the sliders do, and I mean, really understand them, it's actually very easy to look at an image and say, okay, you know, I want more of this or less of that, and then know exactly what you're going to need to do it. And then once you've established, okay, so I need to change the highlights, that's fine. Then the other challenge is in learning Photoshop, I always refer to the cooking shows. Whenever you watch the cooking shows and it comes time for them to put the seasoning on, the chef always says flavor to taste. That's their phrase. And that's really a big part of Photoshop. There's no one setting or one power of setting that accomplishes everything you need all the time. So as long as you understand what the settings do, it's really a matter of flavor to taste. How do you want the finished image to look?
How did you get to where you are nowadays?
Teaching, right? Okay. So I think we're going on about 9 years at this point. I was invited to teach a workshop, and honestly didn't really think people would be interested in hearing me teach a workshop, but I did it and enjoyed it. Got a lot of good feedback. So started doing some more teaching at local camera clubs and things like that, and just kind of building up some momentum. I was getting a lot of requests to teach. And then there was also this thing called YouTube out there, and my mind started connecting dots. And I thought, wow, like the challenge with teaching and making money at it, camera clubs don't pay a lot. They don't have a big budget. And only people in, southeastern Pennsylvania, Philadelphia area really know about me. So I thought, wow, maybe I could use this platform called YouTube to create demand, put out some tutorials and videos, and that, creates the opportunity for people to hear me teach, see what I have to say, etc. So I started the YouTube channel with no intentions of being a YouTuber. Again, it was the idea of essentially create these videos that would basically become auditions, for lack of a better phrase. And the YouTube channel took off. So it's like, okay, I guess that's a good problem to have. So I stuck with it for a couple of years while I was building up the teaching opportunities. Because I wanted to teach at the big trade shows. I wanted to teach for camera clubs. I wanted to really teach anywhere there was an opportunity to teach. And it just took off, really. And the pandemic, ironically, for me, turned out to be this almost like silver lining kind of scenario, because once everything went virtual, that also opened up opportunities to teach all around the world. So I've been doing presentations for camera clubs in the UK, Australia, South America, Canada, all over the place. Because now everybody knows how to use Zoom. Even though the world's opening up and camera clubs are going back to in-person meetings, they've also realized, wow, like if we invest in a big screen TV and internet access, we can have speakers from all over the world. So, not just in-person speakers that are local to us. So it's kind of worked out great. And that's literally what I do full time. And so the payoff, the bonus for me now at this age, I shoot what I want to shoot, when I want to shoot it, how I want to shoot it. And my client is essentially my teaching. So when I shoot, everything I'm doing, I'm looking at it from the standpoint of what lesson can I illustrate with this? What can I use this for from a teaching standpoint? And that's how I justify, for myself from a business standpoint, as long as I can tie it to a lesson that I can then either monetize that lesson online or, do it as a presentation, then it's a worthwhile, piece of effort for me to put in to create that shot.
So you got into YouTube as well then?
Yep. And again, YouTube, I don't do the YouTube tutorials anymore. Literally from the beginning, my intent was to show people what I can do. But what I do at this point is essentially a video podcast. Every Wednesday evening, 6 p.m. in the US, I do a 60-minute live stream called The Last Frame. And it's part a little lesson or editorial, part Q&A. I'm really big on, trying to help people with the problem solving and really more than anything, trying to teach people the problem solving aspect. Again, I said this earlier, but because of all these great resources we have, we kind of get a little bit lazy with the way we seek answers to things. And so, especially in the photography world, new photographers will tend to ask very open-ended questions that will get them a lot of opinions, but not really the help that they need because they haven't, the person asking the question hasn't provided enough context.
Yeah.
So I'm a stickler when I do my Q&As. It's like, if I answer this, I'm just going to give you an opinion about what I do, and that's not going to help you. Tell me more about what you're doing. Let's get the context. And sure enough, 99% of the time, by the time I get the context, the answer that I would have given as an opinion is nowhere near the answer that really helps them. Yeah. And by doing that, I can also help them avoid a lot of the mistakes that they may make based on mistakes that I've made, in trying to learn how to do it.
So would you go back to doing any wet film?
Nah, no desire. I always joke, one of the lessons I give photographers is don't use 4-letter words. Remember what your mama taught you. And that's referring to things like rules. It's referring to things like auto for a camera. And then I always finish that with the joke of film. Now I'm really glad that I learned on film. Again, I said before, it created a discipline which has been tremendously helpful. But my wife is a college professor. Her college has a darkroom, and I have access to use it. And once every year and a half or so, I say to myself, you know what? I should just go buy some paper and I should go do it. And then 5 minutes later, I'm like, no, what are you thinking? Like, no, like, I don't have the patience to go back and do it. I love the immediacy of digital. I think it's great. Yeah. And I'm a big believer in the idea, the world evolves, right? Not to get really corny, but it does. The world evolves. And I think most of that evolution is good. And even when that evolution is bad, fortunately, as a human race, we tend to kind of work it out over time.
Yeah.
Frequently takes longer than it should, but we kind of tend to work it out, right? I think from a creative standpoint, we're so blessed with all this technology we have right now. So blessed that film just doesn't make sense to me anymore. And I understand there's a whole new generation of photographers that are just completely enamored with film. And I think it's wonderful because I understand the benefits they're getting, but I have no desire to go back there.
Can't say I blame you too much.
Yeah.
So, final question.
Sure.
Mac or PC?
Mac all the way, but I was slow to get there. I've been a Mac user for probably about 8 years now, which in the photography world means that I was a PC user much longer than I should have been. I always struggled just looking at the price tag on Mac. Could not justify it. And finally, there was a photographer who had been to a couple of my workshops, and he made the mistake of admitting that he used to work for Mac. That's why it took so long. But he made it his mission. He was going to get me to switch. And what the final tipping point was, I would always argue, like, look, I can buy a PC for a fraction of the cost. And he would come back and he'd say, yeah, but how often do you upgrade your PCs? And because I wanted this speed, and because software was getting bigger and bigger, and you needed the processing power, I would always upgrade my PCs like every 18 months when the processors took a big jump. And he said, that right there is the point. He said, you buy a Mac, you won't upgrade it for 5 years. I was like, no way. He's like, talk to people that use Macs and just simply ask them the question, how often do you upgrade? So I did. I actually started doing that. I started talking to photographers that were using Macs, and universally, every one of them without hesitation said easily 5 years. Your computer will last you easily 5 years. So at that point, when you started to do the math, the Mac was actually cheaper. Cost more money up front. That part was painful, but the Mac was actually cheaper. And sure enough, that has been the case. Most of my Macs, I go easily 6 years, almost 6 years before I do an upgrade. In fact, I just upgraded recently. For the first time in my life now, I'm only using a laptop. Now I have big screens here to work on, but I'm using one of the new MacBook Pros with the M1 Max, and this machine is a beast. I absolutely love it. So, yeah.
Well, I'm on a M1 iMac, the 24-inch one.
Yep.
I absolutely love it.
Yep.
And I was using a MacBook Air. Prior to that, I had a MacBook Pro.
Yep.
But I found the problem with those, because I do a bit of video as well.
Right.
You get the fans kicking in all the time.
Yep.
With the M1 iMac, can't even hear it.
Yeah.
And it's just terrific.
Yeah.
And it does the job for me.
Yeah. I mean, the thing with Mac computers, they just work. And that's what you want. Right?
I mean, the trouble I had with Windows computers, you wouldn't believe. Particularly, I used to do a bit of video quite a long time ago, and I was using the Windows machine, and it just wouldn't do what I wanted it to do. And then this is oh Christ, around about 2000-ish. Must have been about 2000, maybe earlier than that. I got the G4 dual gig Mac, transformed what I did.
Yeah,
it just worked, and I haven't looked back since. And I've had Macs ever since. Yeah,
yeah. So PCs, unfortunately, they require, they work, but they require a lot of maintenance to to keep them working. And I need the computer. I need to be able to turn it on and do what I have to do. So, yep.
There we go. We thrashed that one out.
Yep.
Joe, fascinating story. Loved it.
Well, thank you, Tim. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
No, you're most welcome.
The Tim Heale Podcasts. Ordinary people's extraordinary stories.